All right, everyone, welcome. This is going to continue lecture 5, and this is the continuation of chapter 4 on liberalism in the, what was it, Churchill, I think is his name? Burchill, excuse me. Okay, so we hit the first 3 major sections of the chapter in lecture 1. We will turn to section 4, which is the final section of the chapter, but there's a lot here, so I thought I'd just kind of break it down. Bear with me. I've been doing this since like 7 a.m., and it has been 13 hours or so today. I am absolutely exhausted, but I'm going to get through this. Okay, so we talked about Fukuyama and Fukuyama's end of history and the idea that neoliberal democratic capitalism was going to sort of take over the global system inevitably, right? And we talked about the Kantian triangle and a lot of the stuff about democracy. Um, but there's a whole other piece to this about the economy, right? About the spread of neoliberalism as well as democracy, right? And so while Fukuyama caught a lot of criticism for his ideas on democracy, for the most part, his ideas on neoliberalism did sort of play out, uh, which is troubling, right? Because if you were hoping that one of the 2 legs of his theory, democracy or neoliberalism, was going to spread around the globe, I think most people would have probably chosen democracy rather than neolib. But that's the way it played out, right? I would also sort of note that, in the last 10 years, there's questions about whether neoliberalism is going to last, right? There's criticisms domestically. There are also sort of, these gigantic international, interstellar corporations that have basically broken free of governance. And so the system looks to be changing, right? There's more protectionism on the rise, tariffs are rising. Um, there's very little breakup of sort of monopolistic systems, which is not really part of neoliberalism, right? Neolib is about competition and all this kind of stuff. And so the system does seem to be changing. But, this was a better prediction by Fukuyama than democracy was. And Birchill, who is the author of this chapter actually, says the state plays a crucial role in the economic development of industrial societies, protecting embryonic industries from external competition until they're ready to win global market shares on an equal footing. There are few, if any, examples of states emerging as industrial powerhouses by initially adopting a policy of free trade, right? And so you are almost invariably going to get protectionism in every single society on earth, especially those that are trying to develop and build their own industries. And I would point out a couple of examples in modern times of states that have sort of moved through the theoretically linear modernization process, right? So the 3 on my list would probably be China, Japan, South Korea. You might add a state like Vietnam to this list. All export-oriented democracies, which we'll talk about, export-oriented versus import industrialization substitution. Um, but all of the group that I just listed, these sort of East Asian tigers, they all started out very protectionist, right? And there was a lot of government largesse and subsidies to nascent industries and to strategic industries. So in the 80s, it was Japan with automobiles. Um, South Korea went through a very interesting transition in a remarkably short period of time. We're talking 2 generations or so, from one of the poorest countries on the entire planet to one of the wealthiest on the planet at this point, or at least like sort of that middling upper level, right? But Japan and South Korea both eventually, for the most part, entered the free trade system, right? They sort of started playing fairly by the rules. They're interesting systems. They have their own idiosyncrasies, especially South Korea with their sort of chaebol conglomerate business model, um, which doesn't look a whole lot like the US's model. But China never did. China never made the transition toward the sort of free trade policy, opening up of their politics, building up the middle class, all of these things, right? China has stuck with high levels of protectionism, high levels of strategic, strategic, what are they called? Subsidies. My mind is melting. And this is how they built industries like their solar panel industries, which basically runs the world. Their EV model, which basically controls the world's EV market, other than maybe Tesla, but Tesla isn't really opened up to international competition because of U.S. protectionism, and European protectionism as well. But China has sort of strategically dominated all of these different markets, but they never made the turn that Fukuyama expected. They never did open up until to neoliberal model and democracy, blah blah blah. So there are a lot of different ways this can go. Okay, the next section is about globalization, which used to be a huge topic, and it is less so these days, I guess. There are fewer books and publications and stuff being written about it. The globalization is still important and has its goods and bads, right? But the true neoliberal movement started probably in the 70s, right? We're talking about like Nixon meeting Deng Xiaoping from China, a little bit of opening up and the special economic zones in China, the creation of the Bretton Woods international currency system. And then moving into the 80s, we get Thatcher, Reagan, and the real turn toward neoliberalism. At this point, you also get a shift from things like manufacturing and I don't know, technology, these sorts of things, toward finance and severe deregulation of finance and currency swapping and all of these sorts of things, right? All the agglomeration of all the above mentioned things is where neoliberalism got its roots. And this is when you really start to see some massive cross border international corporate structures, which we'll talk about a little bit too. The goal of sort of the neoliberal model, globalization, etc., um, very much shifts from a welfare slash social justice system of the, I don't know, 50s, 60s, especially across Europe, maybe not as much in America, but it shifts far more toward efficiency, profit, productivity, all of these sorts of things. I would argue it wasn't really that before, especially like I just said in America. There is, and historically has been, a far more robust social safety net system in Europe, but it was never really part of the American system per se. But you do get a backlash toward or after the 1960s, the drug and hippie culture, the civil rights movement, the anti colonialist movement, all of these things sort of caused a right wing backlash against the leftist culture of the time, right? And they say the power of the state to regulate the market was eroded by these forces of globalization, and in particular, the finance market and the currency markets. At the same time, as neoliberalism is kicking off, globalization is kicking off, and was probably part of the purpose of the entire project of neoliberalism, was to erode the power of labor, erode the social welfare system, But at the same time, manufacturing in America was also eroded as we shifted production out for cheap goods. No, labor laws. You could sort of abuse your workers. All of these sorts of things, right? And throughout the '90s and 2000s, especially, there were a lot of exposés on companies, hiring child labor, basically having enslaved labor in their factories. Nike got busted, DuPont got busted. There were a whole bunch of that. And I don't know that that has changed any. They've certainly gotten better at hiding it. Yeah, so you also get a really massive increase in inequality globally, also in the United States. The US has really high inequality, especially for a developed country. We're not the most unequal place on earth. I've misstated that before. There are places like Brazil that are more unequal. But for a sort of developed, stable democracy, we're really we have a high Gini index, according to the University of Texas. You also start to see a lot more tax evasion, tax avoidance strategies. Corporations shifting their corporate headquarters to like the Maldives or Panama or Ireland. And it seems like this book's a little out of date, but it there's a feeling, although it will take time to settle, that this is all being supercharged by this new AI economy, right? The inequality, the tax evasion, the multi international corporate structures and umbrella companies and subsidiaries and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, section 4B, the nature of quote free trade. So we talked about sort of setting the stage for the free trade argument with John Stuart Mill and not John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, and with David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. And there are theorized benefits of free trade, right? You should get maximization of economic growth because protectionism, at least theoretically, distorts the market, right? Now, sometimes the market should be distorted. That is what the state is for, right? Therefore, arguably tax collection, some redistribution of wealth, social safety nets, and making sure monopolies don't arise, and making sure there's not exploitation of labor and things like this, right? Um, but for the most part, from economic theory at least, you want as free a market as you can get if you want to maximize efficiency and maximize the use of capital, the use of investments, all of these sorts of things. You should also, at least according to Ricardian theory, get the most efficient use out of your sectors or your factor values or whatever it might be. Um, so you don't try to build an entire economy that's domestic, right? What you try to do is do what you're best at and then trade for what you're not best at, right? And that means everybody can focus on what they're best at, and so you get higher marginal value out of what you're focusing on. Pure competition tends to lead to innovation. And this is another reason why competition can be a great thing, right? And protectionism can lead to stagnation and can eventually lead to a lack of competitiveness. Um, and this is basically the ISI model, right? I talked about the export oriented model of Eastern Asia. So Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, China, and others took a very let's start building just very basic products, export them for as cheaply as we can, right? Because our advantage is in cheap labor, and then eventually reinvest and sort of move up to the second level, and then move up to advanced industrial capacity and things like this, right? And by sort of using cheap labor and by focusing on exports, um, And because of the sort of rapacious competition that exists on the international level, they tended to get increases in technological advances. They put a lot of money into R&D. Uh, this is why South Korea runs chips these days. South Korea and Taiwan, at least, microchips. And China runs green technology for the most part. They've locked up solar. They locked up EVs. On the other side, you have what's called import substitution industrialization. And this is all about protectionism, and it's all about developing a insular domestic market, right? And so here's the breakdown basically. Think Brazil. Instead of the export oriented model that I just explained to you from Eastern Asia, South America took a different approach. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do to protect ourselves from being sort of exploited by exporters or those who are already developed beyond our means. We are going to lock down our borders. We're going to put high tariffs on imported products. We're going to shuffle state money into chosen industries like automobiles, refrigerators, all this kind of stuff. Kind of the same idea that like China, Japan, South Korea all started with, right? However, their intention was not to compete on the international markets and export products. Their intention was to build an entirely domestic market. Um, the problem is when you insulate your markets from competition, you end up with cronyism. There's no need to innovate because the state's just paying you out, right? And so eventually, not only can you not compete on the international market, you're building shitty, shoddy products, and you're falling further and further and further behind in international competition. And your citizens start to get angry that the products that they're buying are garbage, right? And then you just can't compete. And so this ISI model is sort of I guess, I don't know, the warning of protectionism, right? And if you don't get out of protectionism eventually, you're going to crumble, right? And this is one of the criticisms that the US EV industry gets a lot is that, look, China's building $8,000 excellently well built, long lasting BYD EVs, right? Whereas Tesla is building $90,000 unaffordable EVs, and that they could never compete unless America protected them, right? And eventually, that's going to mean bad things for the American economy. It's going to mean no innovation. It's going to mean a falling behind, and it's going to mean further pumping money into this company that we is too big to fail or something, right? Like we've heard that argument before. And so protectionism can be scary. You've got to play the game right. Okay, what are the problems with comparative advantage? First, during Ricardo's era, there were assumptions that capital's just immobile, right? Like we can't invest cross border. We invest in our own domestic business. We pay our own domestic taxes. We support our own domestic citizens. The free flow of capital in today's society means that hedge funds don't really care about their where they live or the citizens around them for the most part. They only want to maximize profit and they only want to minimize costs, including taxation, right? And so that does not in any way fit the Ricardian model because Ricardo thought that it was all going to be sort of reinvested back into your domestic economy. Um, let's see. We also have, oh, yeah, Ricardo sort of assumed that states were the traders, right? And so, of course, the state has an eye on improving itself and its own citizens, whereas this sort of intra firm trading doesn't have domestic loyalties because it doesn't have a domestic place, right? Um, where is Elon's domestic citizenry? Is it South Africa? Is it America? Is it Monaco? I mean, is it wherever his yacht is for the week? That kind of thing means that like it's not about the people around you and your community and all of these things, and so that's very much outside of the realm of Ricardian theory. So there's a couple breakdowns just because historical analogies don't fit, right? And he was describing an economy that no longer exists anymore. I would also say that like they didn't really have, if you look at the modern economy, and let's talk about AI for a second. um, there are really weird signals coming from inside these umbrella companies, subsidiary hierarchical business models, where companies, AI companies, say, are investing in chips, right? Um, Made by, say, NVIDIA, driving up the stock prices of AI companies and of the chip makers, um, and then it's being used to buy more AI and more chips, right? But the money is stuck in this like vertical chamber, and the value of this company is somehow based on the value of this company, but they're buying everything from each other. And some modern economists say, like, this is a shell game and it's going to collapse eventually. Um, and it's just unsustainable. We're going to have to wait and see. Um, but it seems unsustainable. And so it's a bit of a concern for a lot of like modern tech economists saying this like loop is disconnected from the wider economy, and when it collapses, it's going to fall hard. And the author actually refers to the modern economic system, the neoliberal model, especially moving into the 2000s, not as neoliberalism, but as corporate mercantilism, right? It's not even about improving your estate. It's about stealing as much wealth and amassing as much wealth as possible and resources and mineral or critical materials, etc., for the corporation. And there's this massive disconnect today between corporate entities and governance, where government is losing power relative to corporations. The fourth problem with the Ricardian thought is, the rules of the trade system are just eroding. You have subsidies, you've got protectionism, we've got obviously rising tariffs across the planet. China, I mean, not China, the US and Canada are suddenly in trade fights. You've got non tariff barriers, including quotas and stuff like that to get around tariff rules on the international scene. And you also have what's called sort of the race to the bottom by for corporate taxation, where corporations are saying, all right, well, if you lower your taxes, we'll move our corporate headquarters to your land. And so you have entities or state entities like Ireland, Panama, etc., basically saying like, we'll cut your tax burden if you just move here. And so some economists and some world leaders are saying like we need a like flat minimum tax rate across the planet so that we don't just keep racing to the bottom further and further, and middle class citizens are having to pay the tax burden while corporate profits and the elites sort of get to escape the system, right? Okay, the fifth is sort of what are the very modern concerns. One is Wallerstein's argument about the core, which would be like the Western countries or advanced democracies, setting up and using the system to keep periphery countries in the periphery, right? And this would be like the IMF, the World Bank, etc., force what's called austerity measures and neoliberal rules onto developing countries to basically control them, extract resources, and ensure that they never actually develop through the system, right? There's also little consideration of fellow citizens anymore. Um, Even the Rockefellers and folks like that during the Gilded Age saw that they should give back something, and built hundreds of libraries across the United States. Like I don't think Rockefeller was necessarily a good dude. I'm not trying to laud the guy, um, but there's been a disconnect between elites and their own domestic country and their fellow citizens and their tax obligations to their state and the rest. And I don't think that Ricardo would have ever really thought about that. Okay, the final problem here is comparative advantage is meaningless if we're talking about strategic goods. So we learned some hard lessons during COVID when we could suddenly no longer get PPE. We learned hard lessons about selling military equipment to foreign countries, like when Reagan basically pumped armaments and weaponry to the Taliban, or they were called the Mujahideen, to fight off the Russians, right, during the 1980s. Well, they took those weapons and then killed American soldiers with them later on, right, in Afghanistan. And arguably some of that training as well went into the 9/11 plot, right? And so, like, these things can come back to bite you. It's the same with AI computing. America and China both are talking about restricting models, so that the other can't catch up, right? The most, you know, technological prestidigitators, future readers, are basically saying America only has about a 6 to 9 month advantage in AI computing against China, right? And so they're talking about locking down some of the what do they call those? I don't know, the models on the forefront, right? The technological horizon, and basically saying like you can't have any of the models unless they've been out for a year or something, right? Same with microchips. Nvidia makes the best microchips on earth. For a while, there were big limits on who could get their hands on them, but recently, both China and Saudi Arabia and others that were, had been on blacklists and bans, are suddenly able to sort of get these microchips from Nvidia. And then finally, I would point out like personal data. What happens to our personal data? Should it be siloed? Should it be protected by domestic entities, right? To ensure that it does not get out, that it's not being hacked, that it's not being sold by companies to private, entities or foreign governments and things like this. So there are a lot of things where Ricardian advantage and this sort of free trade system can really backfire on you, or at least you have to be very thoughtful about these things, especially if an emergency comes up. Okay, section 4C, sovereignty and foreign investment. Um, so, from what we know about developing states, they have a very hard time growing through their own economics, right? And this is why China, Japan, South Korea all focused on export oriented. They also made it very friendly for foreign investors to come in, although China is backing off on that some. Um, but it means you have to attract foreign investment, right? You can't pay for all of these upgrades, infrastructure, et cetera, just on your own domestic tax base, especially if you're sort of a low man on the totem pole state, right? Unfortunately, this gives investors a remarkable amount of power over the domestic internal politics and economic decisions and economic structure of those developing states who are basically begging for investment, right? And it means they can strong arm some of these leaders. They can ask for absurd subsidies. They can ask for no taxation policies. They can say, look the other way when we commit, labor abuses and human rights abuses, things of this sort. And it means a degradation of the whole concept of the Westphalian sovereignty, right? Some giant corporations and hedge funds are also becoming so powerful so wealthy that they're not only influencing sort of developing countries, they're also influencing the biggest economies on earth, including the United States, through political campaign donations. These include companies like NVIDIA, run by Jensen Huang. It includes Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla, etc. Zuckerberg at Meta, right? Like we all know these people's names. But the amount of money that they throw at politicians, not only uh, money that can be traced, right, but also money that cannot be traced through like 501c3 nonprofit donation organizations and the rest. The money in American politics is growing out of hand, right? And this just brings up more questions about sovereignty and who has it, right? Are the citizens the one sending representatives who actually represent them, or are big corporations and big money donors um, influencing the economy, right? And I think most people would be reticent to say like, no, they don't have any influence. So that can be troubling as well. Credit rating agencies like Standard and Moody's and what is it? Standard and Poor, S&P, and Moody's. Right? I just had to like separate them. What they do is they make bond ratings. They are ratings agencies. They collect a whole bunch of data. They watch political movements. They look at economics indicators, and they provide risk assessments for treasuries, for you know, not international, but like state bonds, for corporate bonds, all kinds of stuff. They basically provide risk assessments. And so this means that they also have a remarkable amount of power in determining who succeeds and who fails, or who is actually successful in pulling in investments and who is not, right? And I would point out that some of these companies suck at particular times. None of them got the 2008 financial crisis right, when we had collapsing mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, quantitative easing projects, and all of this shit. None of these companies got it right. They all had these collateralized debt obligations, these CDO packages rated as like AAA plus, the best possible investment you can make, super duper safe, right? And then it fails and the entire system collapses, and we have to buy out insurance companies and banks. And so, like, as much influence as these ratings agencies have, there's a lot of skepticism there about like, where do they come up with these numbers? How do they assess risk? All of these problems, right? Okay. The last part is about sort of terrorism. You know what? I'm just going to leave that. We've had enough. Yeah, it's 35 minutes. Okay. This is the last lecture of the unit. This was a lot. I think the other one, the coming units will be a little less, but we really had to establish some groundwork. And I like hitting it hard at first and then easing off y'all a little bit as we move on. Paper one is up. If you can't find it in the assignments, you can also find it in the announcements. If you have any questions, please reach out, comment anywhere in the announcements section, on my YouTube, whatever, email me, whatever. Thank you so much for being here, and have an amazing day.